Good afternoon, everyone. If you could please take your seats, and then we can start with the closing session of this day. Thank you. Yeah, welcome everyone to the last session of today. My name is Christine Richter, and I'm a senior scientist in sea level research at the Norwegian Research Institute NORS in Norway, in Bergen. And I'm just thinking today, Bergen is actually just like Vigo a little bit, just colder, darker, and a bit wetter. But the harbor actually looks very much the same. So I feel very much at home. Yeah, so this is the last session of today, and I have the pleasure to moderate it. But before we start with the session, I'd like to make some general announcements while I still have your attention. So after this session, there is a side event. It's the Marine Biodiversity Observation Network for Europe meeting. It is in this room. It starts at 6 o'clock. So you're welcome to just stay in this room. Those who participate, last minute participation is also possible. Also for tomorrow, we're starting at 9. Keep your badges. You will need it for the conference tomorrow. You will also need your badge for the evening reception tonight. Which will be hosted by the regional government of Galicia, and it will be held at the Museo do Mar here in Vigo. There will be buses, so the event starts at 7 at the museum. There will be buses starting here at the venue 6:30, taking those who want to take a bus to the event, to the museum. There will also be buses to return to the city center and to the venue here. Yes. So now again, welcome, and I have the pleasure to lead you or guide you to this through this closing session for today, which is on coastal resilience and blue carbon. So there are 2 ocean decade challenges that are particularly relevant for this session. This is to protect and restore ecosystems and biodiversity, and to increase community resilience to ocean hazards. And since the beginning of the ocean decades, there have been 36 projects, ocean decade endorsed projects, that directly address these challenges. There have also been more than 150 projects that aim to protect and restore marine and freshwater ecosystems and biodiversity, and projects that directly and concretely contribute to relevant restoration targets, including degraded seabed habitats and coastal ecosystems. Today, in this session, we will launch 2 European Marine Board documents that will hopefully help to keep the momentum and inspire and guide future projects. So this will be the position paper number 27 on building coastal resilience in Europe, and the policy brief number 11, yes, number 11 on blue carbon challenges and opportunities to mitigate the climate and biodiversity crisis. We will have 2 launch presentations given by Sebastian Velasante and Natalie Hicks, and afterwards we will also have a panel discussion. We might have an empty chair, so this session is a little shorter than the others. It's 1 hour, so we will see how that goes. Yeah, so now I'd like to welcome Sebastian Velasante to the stage after I introduced him. Sebastian is an associate professor in economics at the University of Santiago de Compostela. He is also a distinguished research contract at the Opportunist program in Galicia, and he's the director of the Equal Sea Lab at the Department of Applied Economy or Economics of the University of Santiago de Compostela. So he carries out research to understand the role of knowledge and institutions to support sustainable transformations. Sebastian has also been the chair of the European Marine Board Working Group on Coastal Resilience, and I have had the pleasure to work with him on this position paper, and he will now present the launch presentation of this paper. Thanks, Sebastian.
Thank you, Christine. 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 Thank Thank you very much, Christine, for your kind presentation. It's a real pleasure to stay here to share this work that we have been collectively working with different experts and interdisciplinary teams, thanks to the amazing and invaluable help of the EuroMarine board. And for us, it's a real pleasure to share the work that we have been doing. I have been asked to just do a 10-minute presentation and to focus especially on the high-level message and the key message from the positioning paper that we have been developing together. And outside the room, you can see a desk in which we have a lot of printed copies of the document. I will be also sharing the QR link to, in case you are able to access through the website. Building coastal resilience in Europe. Basically, well, in the beginning, in the working group, we were trying to realize and to reflect collectively what is coastal resilience and how we can operationalize resilience into concrete policy action for policymakers. Basically, we finally agree on this definition based on the existing literature and the existing evidence on resilience, and we define resilience in the positioning paper as the capacity of coastal, natural, and socioeconomic systems to persist, adapt, and transform when dealing or when faced with disturbance or shocks that can be abrupt or slow disturbance induced by factors such as, for example, sea level rise, extreme events, and human impacts, but at the same time maintaining essential functions of coastal ecosystems. This is the main definition through the document. You will be see that we have a box into the document at the beginning of the positioning paper in which you are able to see the different definition that we agree based on the expert knowledge and based on the solid review that we conduct during the whole exercise that we did in this document. The document is divided in several chapters. One of the chapters, chapter 2, is about the concept and frameworks that the scientific community and policymakers are being able to develop from the scientific point of view, but also to try to operationalize into concrete policy decisions. In Europe, basically, chapter 3 is about pressures and impacts on the different coasts in Europe. Chapter 4 is basically about what type of tools, barriers, or obstacles or enables that policymakers and users are able to deal with when trying to build coastal resilience in Europe. Then we also try to use the previous chapters from frameworks to highlight and identify different pressures and impact through the 3 case studies in order to illustrate or showcase how the different case studies in Italy, Belgium, and Ireland were able to try to tackle or to overcome these barriers in order to build resilience over time and space. And finally, we also identify some challenge, not only for communities, but also for policymakers as well as for the scientific community, and also policy recommendations, because this is a positioning paper for policymakers. Well, just to highlight, we review probably the most important frameworks, such as, for example, the ecosystem services framework, the vulnerability assessment framework to assess coastal resilience. But at the end, we were trying to identify what are the pros and cons of the different frameworks, especially thinking on policymakers on how these different frameworks are able to help them to some sort of present a diverse portfolio of options in order to try to operationalize them and to take decisions on the field. And for the first time, we were able within the group to identify and to develop a 6-step approach to build coastal resilience in European coasts. And also, of course, this is also potentially be possible to extrapolate to other socio-ecological contexts. And following this 6-stage approach, I do not want to spend too much time in detail, but basically the first step is try to conceive the management process as a long-standing and adaptive process and a learning process through coming back and forth between the different decisions that policymakers are able to take over time and space. Second one is possible to try to co-produce or co-develop with different stakeholders through the process, knowledge and developing options for the best of the key research question or the key challenge that the given case study is able or need to develop or to address. Finally, define the resilience issues that are able to address and select which of these frameworks are best situated to try to respond to a specific challenge that policymakers need to address. Number 4 is basically to define coastal socio-ecological system boundaries, structure, and dynamics. This is very important because the temporal and the spatial scales of the problem can be quite different depending on the administrative unit of the unit of analysis when policymakers are trying to address a given problem. And 5 is to try to identify, pilot, and provide capacity building, and specifically on different tools and training for a wide range of policymakers and users. And finally, try to sort and refine possible solutions and identify realistic, but at the same time diverse scenarios or visions over time. As I said, chapter 5 also describes key pressures and impact that influence coastal resilience. And we also were able to identify the most important pressures and drivers that they are currently affecting coastal resilience in Europe. And for each of them, we were able to also identify what are the most important key knowledge gaps that they are acting as obstacles or as increasing uncertainty when policymakers are able to take decisions. In terms of tools, barriers, and enablers to build coastal resilience, basically we were focused on several aspects. Just to summarize, one of them were what type of governance structure a case study or policymaker need to or is able to use when trying to build coastal resilience. What type of financial public or private mechanisms are able to provide to policymakers to try to some sort of trigger transitions or transformative change toward building coastal resilience? What type of modeling, quantitative or qualitative data are available for policymakers in order to collect the most robust and solid evidence to take decisions? Of course, considering which is the level of uncertainty. Other aspects are like what type of infrastructure for coastal protection, like the mixed diverse options like from green, blue, or green, or even hybrid infrastructure through our European coast. Also, it is important to consider the different local context and characteristics of the social ecological system, because these are important aspects, not only from the natural perspective, but also from the socio-economic point of view. Especially considering not only the cultural aspect, but also the diverse knowledge of users when trying to provide the specific knowledge about, for example, the state of a given fish stocks, for example, but also how important is a given economic activity for them in order to, for example, achieve economic development or fix population or try to tackle unemployment opportunities, for example. And finally, in terms of policy recommendations, we identify basically 5 key policy recommendations that you could read in a very detailed manner for each of them. One of them is to try to adapt an ecosystem approach to coastal management. The second one is to try to include nature, but also people from the beginning of the design of this adaptive process. This is quite important. It can be obvious, but in general, we usually find not only in the scientific literature, but also in the realistic work that we different research groups in Europe are working on coastal resilience, is that most of the time we are considering separate elements or components, nature and people, right? And sometimes we sacrifice, for example, the well-being of small-scale fisheries or industrial fisheries in relation to, for example, conserve ecosystems or vice versa, right? So it's important to consider that both elements are key components of any social ecological systems. Then the third policy recommendation is to try to build adaptive capacity at multiple scale. This multi-level perspective of the of coastal resilience we found through the elaboration of the document that is really relevant. And finally, reflect about the multiple values of the natural and social capital, I would add, based especially on the last and very recent IPBES values assessment, that in which we were inspired about this global assessment, but also other scientific literature that inspired not only to concentrate on the monetary value of ecosystem services or nature contribution to people, that nature is able to provide us as humans and support our life and human well-being, but also other type of, for example, cultural contribution to people or traditional knowledge that users has been conserving or transmitting through different generations over time. And finally, the final policy recommendations is, well, what we have already discussed is to try to follow this, let's say, six-step approach or protocol that we found through the literature that is quite important in order to build resilience over time and space. In terms of scientific recommendations, basically we are suggesting to establish integrated and interdisciplinary research on coastal social ecological systems, also to develop sufficient and consistent and standardized data at observational level, monitoring level, and also data capacity, not only from the natural system, for example, using artificial intelligence or big data, for example, to monitor the state of the oceans, of the ecosystems, but also to try to help how communities and social systems are able to interact each other with the natural system. The third scientific recommendation is try to develop and operationalize, standardize coastal resilience indicators for coastal resilience. Of course, we are talking about here, broadly speaking, ecological indicator, institutional indicator, but also economic and social ones, in order to have an holistic assessment and integrated view, and comprehensive view of the developing of indicators to measure coastal resilience over time. To also improve our model prediction capacity, not only when here we are talking about model, we are not suggesting that people need to, or policymakers need to only use, for example, mathematical models to predict or to better know how a given ecosystem or species in our coast are able to behave over time, but we are, let's say, use a more broad concept or term when we talk about model, right? We are also here talking about qualitative indicators, for example, or qualitative information. And finally, invest in the research on nature-based and hybrid solutions, as we already know, based on the existing literature, that, of course, consider the impact, the co-benefits in terms of environmental and socioeconomic benefits, and impact on various combination of seaward or landward or hybrid nature-based solutions could be a potential way or example to follow and in order to build coastal resilience. In terms of community recommendations, based on the experience from the different experts that were participants and based on the systematic and exhaustive review of the evidence that we collected through the positioning paper, is try to obtain systematic scientific knowledge. I will add also traditional knowledge, because sometimes we mix or we try to merge scientific as well as traditional knowledge, while at the end they can be combining perfectly together through all of the interested parties with clear message and with clear objectives through the different process to construct and to build trust, cooperation, and transparency. These three aspects for building resilience is relevant. Also, to develop another two current national coastal plans to coordinate community actions, because most of the time we see from the different examples that we assess in the position paper is that there are some sort of non-coordinated action between the different communities, for example, and a good way to try to help and to spread good examples, our successful examples over space and time, is to collaborate and to create networks, for example, to co-design citizen science initiatives, and of course to enhance the adaptive capacity of coastal ecosystems. And to end, I think that I am in time. Here you can download the position document, and again you have printed copies, hard copies outside the door. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sebastian. It's hard to summarize 2 years of work in 10 minutes, I know, but thanks for this great overview. So I think, as you said, nature-based solution are one way to support coastal resilience and build coastal resilience. And blue carbon habitats are one ecosystem or one ecosystem that could provide such a solution. With many other benefits, but there are also challenges, and it clearly called for a policy brief. And now I'm asking Natalie Hicks to the stage because she will present the policy brief on blue carbon. Natalie is an associate professor in benthic biogeochemistry at the University of Essex. Her research focuses on understanding the role of marine sediments in carbon cycling, including blue carbon habitats such as salt marshes and seagrasses, as well as offshore sediments. And she is a co-author of the EMB Blue Carbon Policy Brief. So please, Natalie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Kristen, and thank you for staying for the last session. I know it feels like a long day. I'm really pleased to be here launching our Blue Carbon Policy Brief on behalf of our working group members. You can see the names up here, supported well by the European Marine Board members as well. And within the document, you'll be pleased to know it's quite a concise document. We try to keep it as brief as possible. It's a relatively high-level summary, particularly targeting non-scientific audiences. So if you feel you're not an expert in chemistry, this is the perfect document for you. Within the document, we address what blue carbon actually is and discuss some of the challenges and opportunities around that. And blue carbon is one of those unique solutions that allows us to address both the climate and the biodiversity crises. Blue carbon is a relatively new terminology. It's become very fashionable, which is fortunate for someone like me as I research in mud, and I never thought mud and carbon would be fashionable. Blue carbon first arose really as a term in 2009, and it's used to describe a carbon that is taken up and stored in marine ecosystems. And initially this focused on coastal vegetative habitats such as salt marshes, seagrass beds, and mangroves. Now, as our knowledge and understanding of the role of ocean and its ability to take up and store carbon has expanded, so has this definition changed slightly to reflect that knowledge. And so now we know some of our largest carbon stocks are actually in our marine sediments, whether they are coastal, offshore, or deeper ocean. And so there's a lot of discussion as to what makes blue carbon. We know there's a lot of carbon in the oceans, and I'll touch on that briefly in one of my upcoming slides. And in fact, someone asked me previously in a break whether whales count as blue carbon. So there's a lot of discussion of many organisms that live within the oceans and move carbon around the oceans, such as whales and fish. And also there's a lot of carbon held in the deep ocean water masses. These do not count as blue carbon, but they are really important in driving the carbon and moving it around the oceans. And then other plant species such as kelp and macroalgae are really important for taking up CO2 directly from the atmosphere, but they do not store carbon within their habitats themselves, so they are not considered blue carbon. And calcifying organisms are a big discussion as well. They take up carbon and they calcify that, so it's kept within their hard skeletons. But this process of calcification also emits CO2, so we do not at this stage consider them to be blue carbon. So within the policy brief, we use the definition of blue carbon as anything that is a marine ecosystem that has rooted vegetation, rooted in sediments, and anything that is marine sediments, so whether that's coastal sediments like estuaries, mudflats, offshore sediments that we get on the Northwest European shelf and further offshore. The most important thing when we consider whether something is a blue carbon habitat or not is not only their ability to take up carbon, but to store it at long time scale. So taking it away out of the atmosphere and becoming a tool for climate mitigation. So as Kristen alluded to, blue carbon ecosystems are seen as a nature-based solution for addressing climate change, particularly in the long term. So they take up that CO2 and they take it out of the atmosphere and they sequester it for long time scales, often exceeding our generation lifetimes. But one of the biggest benefits to some of the blue carbon restoration work or protection of these ecosystems are the co-benefits that we get alongside that. So we may protect them for their ability to provide us with a climate service, but we're also getting a number of co-benefits alongside that. So by increasing the extent of some of our coastal vegetated habitats, we are increasing that habitat range. So we're promoting biodiversity, we're promoting food provision for the number of different species. So if you restore a salt marsh, you're then providing a habitat not only for different organisms, but you're providing food for example, migrating birds that will come and feed in that habitat, or they underpin some of the commercial fishery species that use those habitats as nursery grounds. So these are really important in terms of moving forward and thinking about, and Sebastian's previous talk focused on coastal resilience, and restoration of some of these coastal ecosystems also plays a vital role in that. So protecting our coasts from things like storm surges or coastal flooding. And so that's a discussion we need to think about moving forward. Now, there are limitations, and this is one of the big things to really consider when we talk about blue carbon. It's not going to be a magic solution to climate change. There are a number of reasons why there's limitations for this, and we need to be aware of this and keep this in mind. One of the big things, particularly for coastal habitats, is the amount of space available for these coastal habitats to exist. We're limited in where they can occur and what else we use our coasts for. If we were able to fully restore all the blue carbon coastal ecosystems to their best maximum benefit for climate, it would still only count towards 2% of our global carbon emissions. So it's not going to solve climate change, but it's an essential part of our toolkit moving forward. And of course, while we're talking about restoration and management of these habitats, climate change is occurring at the same time. So we are seeing some of the challenges, such as sea level rise, which is threatening some of these habitats. We're seeing warming, we're seeing changes in precipitation patterns. I live in, which I believe is very hard to understand, quite a dry part of the UK, and we are seeing increase in the frequency, duration, and longevity of droughts, and that's going to have impacts on some of the organisms that live within these habitats and may impact their ability to take up and store carbon. So in order to maximize the benefits from these blue carbon ecosystems, it's essential that we continue with pursuing other mitigations for climate change and making sure we do reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and try to keep that global warming within the 1.5 degree target. So I alluded to this in my first slide, talking about what counts as blue carbon. The ocean plays a huge role in our global carbon cycle, and we know it takes up about a quarter of all atmospheric CO2 that's emitted into the atmosphere directly through natural processes. I'm pretty sure that's not me having this effect on the slides. But the more CO2 that the oceans take up, the less they will eventually be able to do so, and they reach an equilibrium. And in some cases, we may see CO2 moving from the seawater and back into the atmosphere. The schematic here shows you some of the carbon stores on the planet Earth, and you can see the blue ones are the oceans, and you can see that these vastly outweigh the amount of carbon that's stored in some of the other ecosystems. So it's really important we understand the role that the ocean does play in carbon. Now, I talked about things like whales and kelp and fish, and these are all really important parts of the biological carbon cycle, which takes place within the ocean, everything from coastal surface waters down to the deep ocean. And this is the movement of carbon through the ocean, and it feeds directly into building a base for those blue carbon ecosystems. So the carbon is captured directly, usually at the surface by phytoplankton, and this forms the basis of many food chains. And that carbon moves through the food web and moves through the oceans. Carbon is mobile. When we think about blue carbon, we often think about the stocks of carbon, but actually it's the fluxes and the flow of carbon between those different stocks, which is really important to consider, particularly from a management perspective. As this is a relatively new research area, it's not surprising that there's still a number of uncertainties around this. I've already talked about the limited available area for coastal restoration and management. One of the biggest criticisms at the moment is the rolling out of carbon crediting. So we're seeing a lot more schemes that provide offset for credit. The scientific knowledge is not there to support these, and this is going to be a challenge moving forward. We see this a lot in terms of greenwashing as well. So people may buy into carbon credit offset schemes, but the scientific basis there to prove that they are in fact not only taking up carbon, but storing it for that long term to meet that blue carbon criteria is still not there. We also know for coastal systems that we see a role in greenhouse gases, so they are brilliant for taking up and storing CO2, but they do also emit greenhouse gases, particularly in coastal systems that are brackish or freshwater. We start to see emission of methane and nitrous oxide. We don't fully understand how that changes between different sites and how that changes across restoration scales, but that's a key knowledge gap in terms of moving forward and really understanding how that affects the carbon source or sink status of some of these ecosystems. And of course, moving into the offshore zone where I do quite a bit of my research, decisions that we take on managing the seabed are going to be in discussion with other decisions when we're talking about perhaps where we use grounds for fisheries or where we are putting renewable energy structures. What is the impact going to be on the carbon storage, and how do we make those decisions? So towards the end of our policy brief, we provide a sort of concise summary and also some recommendations for moving forward. And like everything we've heard today, we do need some more data. That is not an excuse for not taking action now. In terms of reducing uncertainties, we really need to understand what's happening with the carbon dynamics within these systems. So how much carbon is actually taken up and how much is emitted in greenhouse gases, and what the balance for that will be. But it's also important to think about the flow of carbon between these systems. So I've given you examples of some of the different habitats, but particularly on the coast, these are all connected. So having a restoration or management approach to salt marshes, for example, would likely impact mudflats nearby, or what's happening in the estuaries or seagrass meadows. So having that seascape approach is essential in terms of moving forward. And in terms of understanding what's happening offshore, we need to understand the role of the carbon. Is that carbon that we see in the marine sediments vulnerable? So if we have trawling, if we are in erecting energy structures, does that impact the carbon? How much does it impact? How do we quantify that? And how do we use that data for making management decisions moving forward? And all of this can be linked into improving our ability to collect data and take those measurements. So having enhanced or tailored monitoring and observation programs. And this may not mean setting up a brand new one, but maybe thinking about some of the resources we have at the moment. Are there environmental surveys taking place? How can we add blue carbon into some of those and start to increase our data knowledge around parameterizing some of this work? For offshore sediments, one of the big questions now is, what is the impact of trawling? Do we need to think about whether trawling is going to have a negative carbon impact? The short answer is we don't have enough data to say whether that's true. And so being able to understand those processes and how that works will allow us to improve our carbon models and predict under different scenarios what that might mean for the seabed, whether it's in carbon terms, biodiversity terms, or irrespective of what your priority might be. And importantly, I think it's really important to consider that this is not a solution that natural scientists are going to come up. It's not marine scientists that are going to enforce this. This is something we need to come at with a multidisciplinary approach. So talking to social scientists, policymakers, economists, engineers, coming up with innovative solutions, but also talking to the communities, the stakeholders that use these. And that's probably the best way moving forward. Now, hopefully that has whet your appetite. You can pick up copies of this. I recommend it as good bedtime reading because it's not too long. If you're interested in downloading a copy, you can download it on the QR code. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Natalie. You may as well just take your seat there. Sebastian, you too. I would also like to invite Anna Lillebø to the stage and take a seat. She will participate in a panel discussion. And Anna is a researcher at the Center for Environmental and Marine Studies at the University of Aveiro. She carries out research on coastal ecosystems, their ecological status and management, as well as applied ecology and nature-based solutions. She has also expertise in EU policies and ecosystem services in a transdisciplinary context. Anna is a member of the Council of the Portuguese Central Hydrographical Region, and she is the coordinator of, amongst others, the Agora Horizon Europe project. Welcome, Anna, and thanks for joining us on the panel. There is an empty chair here too, but this session is a little shorter, so we'll see whether we have time to make use of it. I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask the panel, and if there's time at the end, questions from the audience are very welcome. Yes, but I'd like to start with a general question to all of you. So we've now heard a lot about the changing climate. Sebastian has talked about coastal pressures. So within the context of this changing climate and all the pressures, what are the main challenges for the management of coastal socio-ecological systems and or blue carbon habitats? Maybe we start with Anna. Okay. No.
Very much.
Yep.
Thank you very much for the invitation to take part of this panel and for the question. Some of the things were already very well presented and summarized, but the temporal, I would like to go back to the temporal, spatial and temporal scales. I think this is very challenging. As we saw coastal zones, and it was said, everything that happens on land or even the aquatic continuum, it ends up in coastal areas. So it's upstream, downstream effects. But also if we think about the downstream, upstream effects like coastal erosion, sea level rise, so it will affect also these coastal areas. And we have to take into account this spatial scale. Sometimes the governance scale does not overlap the ecological scale. So this is an additional challenge. Some of the measures that we have to implement are in short term, but they have to be combined with a long-term vision. So this is another challenge that that we face with the management, and this can go for blue carbon restoration, where we expect immediately results, but we have to give time to nature. And as it was also mentioned, climate change is happening. So sometimes there are extreme events that can jeopardize a restoration, but we should not give up because of that. So these scenarios also need to be taken into account. There is another, and sometimes when we talk about different scales, the benefits or the provisioning of these services, and some of them have been mentioned, go beyond the area. So for instance, we talk about blue carbon. The benefits go beyond the area that is being resolved beyond, or vice versa. If we think about eel, they reproduce in the Sargasso Sea, but the benefits are in these coastal areas. So we have to, the management scale can vary very much depending on the problem, identified problem, what we want to address. And also, if we talk about scales, and this, I think it's also a major challenge, is we are, I will say, we are used, or many times we are very good engaging at the local community, at the local level. High level is also very well at the commission level, the missions, all these meetings. The challenge is in between. How we do really connect the local, this is a challenge that we have been facing on the research project, is how we connect these two levels of commitment or engagement. So people are really keen. It's not a problem of interest or willingness. I think it's also a challenge on communication. So I think it's summary what I can say for now. Thank you.
Anna, I think that was quite exhaustive already. So it's really the scales that not always conform with the scales we impose on the problem. So yeah. Sebastian, do you have anything to add?
Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think just to complement what you said, Anna, that in terms of of course, in terms of the scale, I will say that right now we are still a little bit, we made a lot of effort and a lot of scientific advance in terms of trying to address or try to better understand coastal resilience. But I will say that one of the key challenges that we are still struggling is probably to holistically assess the cumulative pressures of, for example, climate change or biodiversity loss through a bundle of ecosystem services or nature contribution to people at the same time in a given space and unit of analysis. That probably will be one of the challenge. Probably other challenge is more related to try to determine or identify what are the tipping points, not only ecological tipping points, but also social tipping points beyond for which users or actors in a given systems are able or not to continue or to adapt to deal with, for example, climate change or storms any social ecological shocks that they need to address. And also maybe another challenge that we found in the position paper was to try to move even more, apart from the scientific advance that we already has been done, is to improve the connection between land and sea, not only at the framework, but also at the policy level, right? That sometimes there is a mismatch between both of them, and this, as you said, in terms of the scale, but also in terms of the decision making that is taken in the field, sometimes are not, let's say, the benefit or the potential cost associated to a given measure is not fully understood, at least at the policy level.
Yeah, thanks. So again, it's the scales and this kind of artificial construct that we impose on this ecosystem, and unfortunately, they don't always conform with what we expect from them. Natalie, do you have to add something, maybe also with respect to blue carbon habitats?
Yeah, just wait for this to kick in.
I think it does.
Can you hear me
Yeah.
okay? Perfect. Yeah, I think I just want to emphasize what Anna said about spatial scales. I think it's really important when we're thinking about restoring EurOCEAN and say coastline, for example, at being aware that that impact will be outside of that habitat. So we think about what the priorities are and where we are implementing those changes and what the consequences could be. And then I think the biggest challenge as a blue carbon scientist is on that fine line of saying this is a brilliant thing for climate mitigation, it is a nature-based solution. However, it is not going to be a very quick win in terms of carbon storage. So, for example, we do a lot of work in salt marshes, and we can see 20 years later that they're still not quite where we'd expect a natural salt marsh to be. Of course, that's site-specific, and there's a load of other factors too. But trying to say to policymakers, we need to restore these for climate mitigation. It's going to be a long term. In the short term, they might actually be emitting more methane than they are taking up carbon. But what you do get is a quick co-benefit win. So you're seeing a change in biodiversity, you're seeing an improved water quality, you're seeing improved coastal resilience as well. So making sure that it's more of a holistic message and not just hinging on the carbon.
Yeah. Yeah, and speaking of this nature-based solutions and blue carbon habitats, so as I understand it, there are a couple of solutions already in place locally, but upscaling is a problem because there's many unknowns. So what are the key knowledge gaps to scaling up conservation and restoration of blue carbon habitats to actually act as this large-scale nature-based solutions that we would like them to be?
I guess the biggest gap is understanding the role of greenhouse gas emissions and being realistic about that, understanding that that's going to be an issue. And then looking at the context and where these coastlines are. So what are the drivers what are the issues? For example, where I am in Essex, we have a lot of salt marshes, but we're also starting to see degradation around the edges. And we know sea level rise is going to be an issue. So thinking ahead, how do we climate proof these nature-based solutions? And so one solution may be to think about breaching the seawall, moving parts of the seawall and allowing the sea to reclaim some of that land. We know historically we always like to modify our environments, and we've modified a lot of our coastlines, and we've taken some of the land back from the ocean, and maybe it's now time to think about what parts of the land we can think about restoring, which builds in the blue carbon aspect, but also feeds into coastal resilience and also would involve engagement in our communities as well.
Yeah, and speaking of its engagement, I mean, you mentioned that we've taken a lot of land from the ocean, and maybe now it's time to give a little bit of this back, but of course that requires communication with communities and also cross-sectoral cooperation. And I think, Anna, this is something you work a lot with. So what type of cross-sectoral cooperation is required to plan for the restoration of coastal habitats, and how can that be enabled? So how do you go about this?
Yeah, to better answer. From this morning session, it was collaboration, and build up trust. And what we did, for instance, and now coming back to the Agora project, which is one of the missions projects on Atlantic Arctic, what we did was we engaged with the stakeholders when we read the call. So they joined us they are beneficiaries of the project. And that's why we ended up with 30 partners. 8 countries and 30 partners. But the point is we have 3 demo areas from Portugal, Ireland, and Norway. And we have in each of these demos a cluster of stakeholders already engaged, from companies, from local authorities, from NGOs, from different sectors. And we were discussing while we were interpreting the call, what is requested on this coastal areas restoration. So, and we applied a living lab approach, meaning that we have the so-called quintuple helix with the business, the academia, we have the environment, we have the governance sector, and then we also have the civil society with citizens included. I know this term can be a discussion, but also with citizens included. So we have a community. So that's also what I mentioned at local level. At each of these demos, we have a community building up on the trust from different collaborations and different projects. And there are two, this is very important for the co-creation process, but also for the multiplying effect. For instance, we are now applying for the associated regions. So we really count on this existing and trust collaboration to enhance these associated regions, where we also want not just research institutes or academia, but we really want other sectors to be engaged, because these actions need to be self-sustainable after the ending of the project. So it has to be part of the process. All these sectors have to be part of the process. If I may just give an example, applying the carbon, what we are doing, we have 2 ways of looking at carbon. One is the carbon, blue carbon stocks. And actually, we were lucky enough to have another project funded where we are analyzing the potential abatement of greenhouse gases from blue carbon ecosystems. So we are also combining this information and seeing the potential of restoration for the carbon stocks and blue carbon. But at the same time, we do know that, and Vigo is also an example, that we have port areas, we have high activities with hard infrastructures very close to estuaries and very close to blue carbon habitats. So at the same time in this project, we are looking at decarbonization with the port authorities, with the oil company, with the tourist sector, where we are testing first the logistics to promote decarbonization on the medium scale port areas, where they are also testing a new formulation of fuel for the tourism to make it more sustainable. So we are looking as a living lab, for one side, how we can improve decarbonization, and the other side to compensate by enhancing blue carbon. And only with all these sectors and having this holistic, this living lab approach, we are able to have everyone on board, and then to see the big picture where everyone can contribute, and then with the details where we can have citizen science supporting the restoration, and everyone knows that they are part of a bigger thing for the region. And we want to demonstrate this to then be able to scale up, which is a challenge, and replicate.
Yeah, thank you. That sounds almost too good to be true, because I imagine with so many different stakeholders with different interests, there's bound to be conflicts, I think. And maybe Sebastian, from your point of view, from the economy point of view, how can like this environmental and social implications be considered? So these different points of interest when making management decisions about the coast.
I think this is a $1 million question, right?
Just tell us about what
Yeah.
we do.
Yeah. Well, basically, I would say that according to the experience of the different members of the working group and our experience in different projects, is essentially starting from the point that when you are managing ecosystem, you need to also manage people, right? And this is essential. And this is always important to highlight, because sometimes we probably focus on one of them or sometimes on another one. But I think this is critical to really consider at the same level people and the state of the ecosystems. The other one is to also try to, The other one is to try to determine or to identify what are the, let's say, the safe operating space into a given, let's say, coast. Like, for example, here in the area of Vigo, for example, here in Galicia, what are the limits for which the ecosystems are not able to provide basic essential functions and ecosystem services or nature contribution to people. But at the same time, what are the just space and the equitable space for people who are depending on this directly or indirectly on this ecosystem, right? So in my view, from the let's say conceptual point of view, keep both components at the same level, and from the, let's say, for policymakers, I would say, try to determine based on quantitative data models for all of the existing source of evidence that the policymakers are able to collect, try to determine what type of secure space, not only from the ecosystem perspective, but also from the equity perspective, in my view, is critical too.
Yeah. Thanks. We have a little bit of time, and I just would like to see if there is an urgent question or so from the audience. Somebody who would like to sit in the empty chair. No, everybody is a bit tired, but that's okay. I have just one more question, or actually a couple of questions, but we talked a lot about also uncertainty. Somebody mentioned tipping points, which are really uncertain when, how much, how strong, and so on. So, or missing data, but that shouldn't be an excuse to not act. But then how do you act? How do you manage this uncertainty? So how do we deal with this uncertainty? How do decision makers deal with this uncertainty? This is an open question to all of you. So
I think one of the key points is to communicate, so that we are very clear about what we are uncertain about. As mentioned, we have to search for more information, for more data. But if we share this information and this data, it's part of the co-development process or co-creation process. It's also to share this uncertainty. But this also requires, and the terms is also transformative way to think, to look at things. So there are other how do you say, issues where we can deal with uncertainty. So why not why not apply the same principle and share this? Yeah. So
yeah, I agree. I think in terms of dealing with uncertainty, being honest about it is fair as well. But that doesn't mean we can't restore systems. So places where we already have those coastal systems, those coastal blue carbon systems, it's unlikely there's going to be any negative impacts if those systems already exist there. And as we worded in the policy brief, we often see this coastal restoration as a no regret scenario. So we don't know, we can't quantify exactly what happens for the carbon, but we know from previous work that there's going to be a benefit for biodiversity and some of the other ecosystem functions. So we can at least make a start with that. And tapping into what Anna was saying earlier about having that sort of community-led approach to projects. We're certainly seeing this in the UK, and a lot of the blue carbon restoration work is not being driven by academics or by government initiatives. It's by stakeholders or conservation charities that perhaps have bought land particularly to do that. And so they are trialing a lot of little approaches that wouldn't be funded traditionally. And so their willingness to work with academics is providing us with some of the data that helps us fill those gaps.
Thank you.
Just to briefly add, according to the evidence that we have right now in terms of the coastal resilience, is the scientific community, we know quite well what we know and what are the level of uncertainty regarding different drivers or pressures or on different activities in our coast. But there are some, let's say, I would say, elements or features that costs usually share when trying to deal with uncertainty. The first of this element, I would say, is that what are the different assets that policymakers need to address or try to analyze? For example, what are the natural assets, financial assets, social assets, and institutional ones? What type of institutional support? What type of financial support, public or public support, are able to provide or to help people to cope or to adapt to a given shock, for example. Another one is social organization, how users are able to organize themselves in order to adapt and to cope with a different level of uncertainty, for example. Another aspect is the level of trust and transparency through the different decision-making process that people are able to develop over time, and even not only for fisheries, for aquaculture, for any type of the coastal activities. We know quite well that if we are able to share these common elements or characteristics of a given challenge based on these elements, 3-4 elements, well, the probability, of course, to deal with to uncertainty, it will not be reduced because of this element. But we know, according to the scientific evidence, is that users are able to, I would say, not successfully adapt, because I do not like the word success, because success can be success today and a failure tomorrow. But let's say to continuously adapt to maintain the essential characteristics of the ecosystems and the well-being of these ecosystems that are able to provide to people, basically.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it's I think a bit of the motto also of our working group was coastal resilience is not a state we will achieve, but it's a constant process in a way. Yes, and I think with this I would like to thank the panel for a good discussion and nice presentations. There are copies, it was mentioned, available of both documents just outside the door. Also remember, buses will leave here at 6:30 for the evening reception at the museum. And tomorrow we start again at 9. And thanks again to our wonderful panel. Thank you.